Hello! In this video, I will be talking about the basics of gouache, more specifically gouache consistency. So I have another sheet here just to demonstrate. This is called the tea to butter method, or the butter to tea method. And basically you start with gouache straight out of the tube, and then you thin it down slowly until it becomes a very watercolor consistency that you can do glazes with. In this video, I'll be demonstrating the butter to tea method, some different techniques, and a couple experiments to get us to loosen up and enjoy the process while we explore the wonder that is gouache. Hello, art friends. Thanks for being here now. This is my practice sheet. This is what I'm going to be showing you today. So I've had a couple people ask me how to get better control over their gouache. I want to share with you some of the basics that I think will help if you want to get better control over this medium. So all you need today is a piece of paper. If you have a black permanent pen or marker, these lines are to examine the opacity of the thickness of the gouache. I have a couple different sizes of brushes here. 2 flat brushes, a 1/2 inch and a 1/4 inch, and a smaller round brush. And the 2 colors I'm going to be using today are Cobalt Blue by Daniel Smith and Lemon Yellow by Winsor Newton. I chose these colors because they have good contrast. The yellow is quite a bit lighter than the blue, so we can see difference in layering them and in opacity as well. I'm going to, straight out of the tube, put some gouache in each container. And you can use one palette. I'm using 2 separate palettes for now. So the 5 categories of thickness, it is a spectrum. It's not like 5 separate categories and you'll go to gouache jail if you use cream instead of milk consistency, but just a way to think about the thickness of the paint. So straight out of the tube, the gouache is buttery. It is really thick and creamy. And if you use gouache straight out of the tube, I have a container of water over to the side and my paper towel. So I've wet my brush and basically completely blotted it off. So it's just damp. There's no water there, no extra water. And I'm just going to dive right in to my Cobalt Blue and do a line across like this. So the butter consistency, if you get it right, I struggle with this a little bit, but the butter consistency is you can do a dry brush technique. Let me bring it over here. Depends on how much you want to drag it, but when you use really thick paint, you get a dry brush technique. And if you want to use it thicker, then it gets almost sticky, creamy. Then just by adding a little tiny bit of water at a time, you get down to the next consistency, cream. So this should just be a teensy bit of water. Make sure it's still very thick paint. It should still be pretty opaque. Even more than that. So there's our cream. And it's going on a lot smoother now that I added a little bit of water. Okay, I'm gonna add even more water. Now we're going for the milk consistency. I feel like these words are kind of self-explanatory. Hopefully you've seen and experienced butter, cream, milk, coffee, and tea. But there we go. The milk is a little more transparent. Still pretty thick. And now we're to the coffee. We keep adding a little bit of water, keep watering it down. Now we're to the coffee stage. And then tea. And tea is really, I mean, add as much water as you want for this one. Make it really light, really transparent. At this point, it's basically watercolor. Some people will say gouache is not watercolor. Yes, there are differences, but I find that it's really interesting to use gouache watered down, especially in the first layers of the painting. So generally you want to be working from thin to thicker paint. In oil painting, this is called lean to fat. It just means you start off with very thin layers and start glazing your colors, and then reserve the thickest paint for the top layers. And this makes sense because of the opacity. My yellow is a little bit less thick than the blue, but let's try. Might not get the best dry brush there. Sometimes it's good to try on a separate piece of paper. Okay, so get a little blue in my yellow still, but there, I got a little bit of dry brush. It's not easy. I'm finding that, especially for dry brush, it helps to hold your flat brush, especially the gouache is easier to control with a flat brush for more consistent brush strokes, especially if we're just learning, practicing the different consistencies. I really suggest using a flat brush. You have a lot better control over it. But also for dry brush technique, if you use the flat brush basically flat against the paper, like you want to use it like parallel to the paper, you get much better, much more flat brush texture there. So we're just going to use a little bit more water. This one's pretty creamy already. So I also wanted to kind of let them overlap a little bit. See what it's like to work a little bit wet into wet here. There's the creamy layer. So I'm gonna do a little bit more dry brush, and then the yellow over the blue. See, getting some of that texture there. And we're seeing that the light color can layer on top of the dark color, but also if they're both wet, they will mix, especially if they're thick. So something to keep in mind. It's harder to get dry brush once there's any amount of water. It's going to blend more. So I just wanted to illustrate that. Okay, now we're down to the milk layer. A little bit more water. Maybe a little bit more paint. I'm letting them bleed and bloom into each other. And you can see yellows tend not to be quite as opaque as other colors. It's because it's a lighter color, so you can really see the opacity of the blue, but not so much the yellow, even at the thickest. And we can go over that. We can always do another layer. So once the wash is dry, you can layer it again. Okay, now down to coffee. This is a very watercolory stage at this point. And then tea, very, very watery. Let them bleed into each other. See how they interact. Now I'm going to, first of all, do a thin wash of some blue over here. Get a little bit thicker. And thicker still. Very thick. And we're gonna let that dry for a minute while we do some experiments on this side. At this point, I have a third little palette I might utilize, but at this point, I just want to play, especially with the watered down layers, like the coffee and tea layers. I want you to start with thinner washes, and really I'm just making circles and interesting shapes here. So let's try some yellow ones, various sizes, and some blue ones. And here maybe start mixing together a little green. So at first I want us to use thinner paint, the coffee and tea and milk. And then I want to start doing a little wet into wet. Let's see what happens if we drop yellow into the blue or green into the blue. And how about blue into yellow? Okay, that blooms really fast. Usually yellows like to move. It depends on the exact colors. You don't need to use these exact colors. Okay, that blue is spreading out really nicely. Let's see. Interesting. And we could do this more technically. We're going to do a little bit more technical stuff over here. But this side of the page, I just wanted to encourage you to explore and experiment and just get a feel for what happens if you take a really watery gouache and you drop it into thicker gouache. What happens if you drop yellow into blue or vice versa? What happens if the underlayer is still kind of wet and you start working into it? This is not the best paper. This is not 100% cotton paper. It's just very affordable bulk watercolor paper that I just use for exercises. But it doesn't really matter. This is just for fun. So I'm gonna let these dry a little bit and then come back and do a couple more things over here and experiment add a couple more layers over there. Actually, I'm just gonna put a little more paint out. A little yellow over here. And we're going to make some much thicker circles, like milk cream consistency, not quite butter, but creamy, definitely creamy gouache. I'm gonna start putting a couple of those down. I tend to use gouache thinner most of the time, so I'm encouraging myself in this video to get used to the butter and cream consistencies, because I started with watercolor. I painted with watercolor for a really long time, and I love that you can do watercolor techniques with gouache so easily, but also it has wonderful opacity that opens the doors to other techniques, like more like acrylic or oil techniques. And that's why it's so important to know what you can do with the different consistencies. So I've got a couple thicker paint circles there. Since I already have really pretty thick yellow on my brush, let's start on this side and let's do dry brush. Now that this blue has dried, let's do some dry brush technique. I'm gonna do the brush again parallel, almost parallel to the paper, and drag it rather quickly. There we go. And if I let my paint out of the tube is very creamy still, so if I was to let it sit a little while, just a few minutes, it will get thicker. It will start to dry, which is why it's also important to have a spray bottle with you. In this case, I'm going to use pretty milk consistency here in the middle. So I did the blue thin to thick this way, and I'm doing thicker yellow on this side and thinner on this side just to compare. And in the middle, I'm because gouache re-wets, or it reactivates, it can reactivate when you do layers on top. The dry brush stayed pretty yellow. You see it got a little green there. But say I want to blend this with the underlayer. It's going to be easier with the thicker gouache. It reactivates very well. Whereas with the thinner gouache, it's happening a little bit, but it's almost a little bit more like a glaze. So the thicker the gouache is underneath, the more easy it is to reactivate. Keep that in mind. That may work to your advantage, or you may not want that. So you may have to plan around that a little bit. Here I'm just going to do a very thin glaze, and I don't want to reactivate the color underneath. The more you move your brush around, the more you're going to reactivate the underneath layer. So I'm trying to do a very gentle, thin glaze. I barely picked up any blue at all. Now with my brush really dry, I'm gonna take a little more of the thick yellow and do this again. There we go. Say I take the really thick yellow and yep, I can still reactivate the blue there because I wasn't quick. I moved the brush around. Now that these are drying, that's the basics. You just have to get more comfortable with it. You have to just practice and get a feel for the medium. And it helps to do exercises, but it helps to just also play around. We learn so much through play. There's so much research about how our brains want to learn through play. So if you can make it fun, make it more fun. It doesn't have to be circles. Maybe you want to do little leaf shapes or houses or something abstract. But I just want to encourage you to explore. Got pretty thick yellow there. Maybe it's like milk consistency, but the blue is rather thick underneath and not quite dry, so it did blend in together pretty well. Let's see if I can get thick yellow over the dried blue. I like to do very organic, abstract shapes, but we can also do lines and dots. I picked the yellow because it is tricky to get a bright yellow on top of a dark blue. You can see right there, I didn't mean to activate the blue quite that much, and it bled, or it, you know, the yellow's not pure yellow anymore. It's greenish all the way over there. But it's good to be able to practice this because sometimes you want to blend it just a little bit. And sometimes with a gentler touch, you can get a pure, bright, opaque yellow, which is, again, hard to do, especially with yellow. So it's a good color to practice this with. I really like how this blue, surprisingly, the blue really blooms into the yellow and does really cool watercolor blooms and cauliflower things. So this is more of a glaze. See, I'm kind of glazing thin over thin. Let's try what happens with a blue glaze on the really thick yellow. It's different. None of it's bad or wrong or good. It's just different effects. What kind of effect do you want to achieve with your gouache? The more you play with it, the more you have better control. Okay, now I'm gonna start just mixing and having fun. Let's do the yellow around the blue. Okay, that's interesting. Drop some in the middle there. Let's see. Just have fun with it. Just let yourself explore. And the more you play, the more you get comfortable. And that's all there is to it. Give it a try. Let me know how it goes. And remember, have fun. Oh, and one more thing that you can do once everything is dry is, because gouache is always you can always reactivate it. Once everything's totally dry, you can see what it's like to blend. You can actually lift off a fair amount of paint, like if you make a mistake, you can lift, or you can do it as an intentional effect. Also, it's just very versatile. I mean, if you don't like this, you're probably not watching this video. You might prefer acrylic gouache or just acrylic paint because it's permanent. But the fact that gouache can do this is actually quite wonderful if you get used to it, if you know how to use it to your advantage. So, yeah. Enjoy exploring. Have fun. Thanks for being here now. Hope to see you in the next video. Bye-bye.